We're live on Facebook, JoyNews on TV. We're also on Twitter, JoyNews on TV. We've got a poll running on my Join line, and the question we asked, do you feel left out whenever government presents its budget statement and economic policy? And 47% said yes, they always feel left out, and 27% says sometimes they feel left out, and 25% that they said they never feel left out. But on Facebook, Salom says, yes, I feel left out. Daniel says, an empty budget leaves all out except family and friends. And Regina Nelly C says, I don't feel left out. God has given me grace and boldness. And Kojo D says, why won't I feel left out if the family and friends are around? And let's go to FL, who says, because it doesn't include the ordinary Ghanaians. And Denoa Goodness says, a budget for family and friends? Is that one to a budget? Remember, the hashtag is hashtag leave no one behind. Kojo?
Thank you, Mapitso Sebidi. A round of applause for her. But you heard those statistics, right? In fact, Maps, if you're with us, I would love for you to repeat them. Was it 47% that said yes, they feel left out of the budget?
47% said they feel left out.
And a further 27% said sometimes.
Yes.
And so
then the 25.
It's only 25% that feel like they are included in the budget. Well, that tells you a story, doesn't it? Thank you so much for that, Mapitso Sebidi. Now I think we can move on to the next. Yeah, we can move on to the next pillar of our conversation, and it's protection. Child protection, social protection. The ministry in charge of it is the Ministry for Gender, Children, and Social Protection. Let me shock you with some more figures, okay? So we heard, you remember how much was allocated to the Ministry of Education? 9.2 billion. Okay, well, in 2017, the Ministry for Gender, Children, and Social Protection was allocated 255 million, 481,323 cedis. So yes, much less, right? Well, in 2018, that figure came down from 255 million to 61 million. That's a 77% reduction. You might be forgiven for generalizing that perhaps government felt that we could do with 77% less gender, children, and social protection spending. How does that make you feel?
Right. Thank you very much. That figure has some explanation to it. In 2017, for the Ministry of Gender, Children, and Social Protection, the budget for school feeding, because then school feeding has moved from Ministry of Local Government to come and join us. So the budget for school feeding that year was 200 million. And then our compensation of the whole ministry was around 27 million plus our goods and services. So we had that figure of 5 million or so for that year. We have to do something, what we call transfer of allocations from one ministry to Ministry of Finance. There was a lot of delays in KETRA payments, so we had to go to finance and then dialogue and see how best we can solve the issue. So after the dialogue, it was agreed that the school feedings budget will be decoupled from that of the ministry. And therefore, the budget of the Ministry of Finance was carrying the purse directly for school feeding, and as well as LEAP. So for that year, the 61 million was the budget released for the main ministry and its implementing agencies. So that year, 2017, we had a release of, I think, almost 300 million for school feeding for that year. And then we have 80 million for LEAP for that year. So even though that allocation was not on our payroll, it was still on the Ministry of Finance. So that's the explanation for that drop in from 200-something million to 61 million. So that's the explanation.
Still,
I mean, we know,
million.
But we have
let's put this in perspective. SNIT spent over 85 million on a new IT system. That's more than the entire budgetary allocation for a year for her ministry. Seriously, what can you do with that?
Well, we try our best. But it's been, in fact, it's been something that we're always in talk with the Ministry of Finance concerning our allocation. And then even just last week, this Tuesday, I think, we were there with the Ministry of Finance requesting for an increase in our ceilings because we realized that it's been, what do you call it, challenge for the ministry. But with the support of sometimes development partners, we're able to do more than our figures can stretch. But there's also...
But now we're going for Ghana Beyond Aid.
Yes.
So development partners...
are going down. And they are taking more and more. For our figures, it's true that Ministry of Finance continue to absorb, especially for the social protection interventions. But our problems has always been the main ministry's work that has to do with child protection and then also the issue of women's empowerment and other issues. But with the social protection interventions, the Ministry of Finance has been doing quite well in trying to absorb what the money that the donor partners support us with. I think for LEAP, allocation from GOG has increased from 40 million to 163 million within 3 years for Ministry of Finance that government has paid itself, making that reducing the contribution of donor partners. So for the past 3 years, that's kind of idea that Ministry of Finance is trying to win and going back towards they're supporting the LEAP and school feeding directly. For school feeding, it's 100% government of Ghana. And the allocation for last year is 423 million cedis for school feeding. That the government of Ghana bore it all completely. So that's the
well,
information.
If we're fortunate enough to hear from the finance ministry, it would be great. I think this is a good time to bring them in. And if you don't mind, I'd like to start you off with a question. In 2017, an Accra High Court, in a landmark ruling, ordered the government of Ghana to establish a domestic violence support fund for victims of physical abuse and domestic violence in this country. I won't ask Madam, I'll ask you. Has that been done?
I think that we are still in the process. We don't have a fund now to support domestic violence and victim support. But I want to come back to the allocation that we make.
Wait, just to be clear, you haven't obeyed the High Court order.
It isn't that we haven't obeyed the High Court's order. If you recall, in 2017, we realized that the funds that we are earmarking for various programs of government is virtually taking away everything to the extent that government cannot exercise any discretion in allocation of resources. So the first thing that this government did when they came into office was to pass a law to cap all the earmarked funds at not less than 25% of tax revenues. Because if you look at the revenues we generate and you look at the fiscal framework that we have, a chunk of the resources go into payment of salaries. You have admitted it here.
98%.
We are also paying for the interest on the loans that we have contracted, and a lot of the loans go back into the MDAs. They are not used by Ministry of Finance. Gender is one of the MDAs that take a chunk of the loans that come from development partners, for which we have to pay interest and also pay for amortization of the loans. When we talk about education, we just look at the 3 billion that comes from the budget. But we're also forgetting that the transfers to the GET fund is supposed to support education. And that is also quite huge. And so if you look at the budget in its entirety, you see that about 9% of the budget is left for discretionary expenditures. Everything is earmarked. And so what government sought to do was to cap the percentage of the revenues that are earmarked for expenditures of government, so that it will create some room for us to exercise some discretion. And so that is how, because we're in the process of that, that is why we've kept a hold on creating more funds. But it's something that we're going to be looking at, yes.
Okay, just before we continue with the point you wished to make, forgive us because we should have asked you to introduce yourself. Can you tell us your name and your designation?
My name is Evelyn Head of Budget Planning and Preparation for Ministry of Finance. And so
round of applause for Madam Evelyn.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think they sent us the right person.
I wanted to clarify the issue of funding. When you said that it appears to us that funding for social protection programs are going down. I think on the contrary, it's going up. Because if you look at the budget, free SHS is social protection. It's making sure that every child is not denied admission into school because they cannot afford.
Can we clarify the difference between social protection and a social intervention? Is it always the same thing?
I think that embedded in the free SHS program is also to make sure that poor families can also send their children to school.
But if I live on the other side of a river, I have to travel 2 hours to get to a school before I can then attend it free. Have you really helped me?
And that is why we're not just looking at paying for them to get to school, but also looking at access. And so increasing access, making sure that children have at least they have schools that are close in their vicinity and they can go to school. So government is also working to make sure that we are improving access. So it's not just about getting them to go to school free. And we should also not forget that at the basic level, there's a lot of money that goes through the common fund to support education, which is not part of the education budget. If you do an analysis of what the common fund is spent on, you see that a chunk of common fund expenditure goes into basic education, that is from primary to junior high school. So Ministry of Finance is in a process of reclassifying the budget. Because we do not do general government budgeting and reporting, it's very difficult to capture the expenditures that go into the sectors from the earmark funds, from also maybe from common fund and even from their own internal resources, what they generate. And so we are in a process of doing that to be able to capture and to be able to report appropriately. So if you see in this year's budget, you see that we are also trying to make sure that we can reclassify the allocations that go into the statutory funds so we can break it down and it will resolve the issues of how much is going into this sector and how much is going into the other sector. That has been addressed. For the LEAP program, there is a line in the budget for social protection. It's normally not part of the gender budget. And so if you look at the budget going to Ministry of Gender, you think that it's been reduced, but there's a line that is targeting social protection in the budget. Again, I think that what I also want to add is that as part of the policy, government decided to align certain expenditures to the statutory funds. The PFM law requires that the funds that are transferred to the statutory funds are actually aligned with the fiscal policy objectives of government and also the budget. And so in 2017-2018, certain expenditures of school feeding was aligned to the District Assembly Common Fund. Some expenditures of the GET Fund was also made to support some improvements in education delivery. So we are looking at all the resources that are available to government, which also includes the statutory funds. And so if you do not see that line going to a sector, it doesn't mean that the sector is underfunded. And I think that I also want to, and I think I've already explained that the space is tight because there are other things that take on, expenditures of government. My last point is on education. You cannot remove the teacher from education service delivery. And so if government is spending, what is education about? They need teaching and learning materials. But the first thing they need are teachers.
98%?
And yet, if you look at the statistics, we still haven't covered. The rural areas do not have the teachers that will have to be there and to support education. And so our policy of government is to ensure that there is a freeze on recruitment in the public sector generally, but education is exempted to make sure that we're able to fill the classrooms with all the teachers that we need to be able to deliver education services.
Are there any
so there's something being done by government to resolve the issues. I just want to say that.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Just before we come back, thank you very much. Just before we come back to our panel to hear their thoughts on social protection and child protection, when will that fund be established? Do you have a timeline?
For
the fund for victims of domestic abuse and
I
so
can't
forth.
say it yet, because we're still putting together the figures, and I'm sure that we'll be able to communicate something through the budget.
Okay,
but
we'll send someone to your office.
Please do.
For more information. Thank you so much. A round of applause. All right, let's whip round quickly for thoughts on child protection, social protection before we go on to health and sanitation. Franklin.
Well, as a libertarian, I do not want problems to be, should I say, categorized, because the mere thought of child protection, gender, and which one is that again? The other one?
Gender, children, and
gender,
social
children,
protection.
assumes that there are no parents for the children, and it also assumes that the government has to be taking care of us. And so, even though the explanations have been given, and I think I agree largely to the reasons why some of the budgets or some of the allocations seem to have been reduced, something else ought to be said. I understand what the lady from the Ministry of Finance said, that the budget is actually tight and things have been capped. What hasn't been capped is the size of government. Because one of the things you see, the Ministry of Special Development Initiative should not exist. And in this budget, it was allocated, I think, about 3 billion Ghana cedis. You hear all kinds of justifications. There's infrastructure for poverty eradication. But what are they doing? They're building toilets, they're building things that are duplicatory, by the way. And so you have a huge chunk of money sitting at the presidency because the ministry is subsumed under the presidency.
How much did you say was allocated?
What we saw was 3 billion.
3 billion.
Well, the idea really is that from it there will be 1 million per constituency for unclearly defined activities. So there's every need to rationalize the budget properly. As I understand, if you've capped all of these and it's making it difficult for you to invest in other socially relevant sectors, the voracious nature of government, and it just didn't start with the current government, but they have been quite clever. You know, during the NDC days, what happens is that they allocate and then it's never enough because the government is always hungry. And then what happens is that they overrun their budgets from the presidency or the Office of Government Machinery to the extent, I think, in 2016, by almost 3 billion cedis more. When the new guys came into office, they saw the trend, and to prevent, well, the characterization that they overspent, actually increased it to 1.5 billion, capped it at 1.5 billion cedis, that is 2017. This year, the Office of Government Machinery has 3 billion cedis. Question, what are they using all that money for? So it's very important that we need to be capping and rationalizing at the center. You see, corruption and waste actually starts, fighting corruption and waste starts at the presidency. And if we are able to solve these basic issues, we can cater to the needs of some of these vulnerable people. There's a disability bill that is being prepared. I wanted to ask the gentleman whether he's seen any movement towards that, because there's none, really. There's been no movement on that score. Otherwise, if there was, there'll be the deliberate attempt to allocate some of the billions going to the Office of Government Machinery to more prudent sectors. So for me, point I was making really is that I'm not saying we should legislate out of existence the Ministry of Gender, Social Protection and Children, but it presupposes that there are no parents, and there's so much abuse that nobody's taking responsibility. My thinking really at the end of the day is that if the economy were built in such a way that people will be prosperous, they wouldn't need protection from the state.
Right, okay. Thank you. Now, Dr. Mensah Brampa, I'll beg your indulgence. I want us to hear a bit from our audience. at this stage. Now, I'm also keeping my eye on the clock. So I'm going to share a bit of information about the health sector before we come to you. And then we want you to give us your thoughts on children, child protection, social protection, and indeed health before we come back to our panel. Now, so in the health sector, from last year to this year, the budget increased its allocation to health by about 4.6%. But you know that we've been having shortages in all kinds of things in the health sector. Immunization, 2017, there was a difficulty in purchasing vaccines. I don't know if you remember. But because of that, some of the immunization indicators that we keep our eyes on were not achieved. And then, of course, this year, my colleague Justice Bedu broke that story about the shortage of plum peanuts, which is a very important food supplement for malnourished children. And so, you know, no shock there that our neonatal mortality increased from 5.8% in 2016 to 7.5% in 2017. These are the key figures. You know, how well we are protecting our children is always an indicator of how well we are doing as a country. And if we are to go by this, we're not doing that well. So let's start thinking about how this budget can be more inclusive to protect children, provide for them more through the healthcare system. Is the solution to increase perhaps the NHIL? Will any of you agree with that? Let's hear from you. Let's hear your thoughts on this. Put your hand up. We'll bring a microphone round. There's a gentleman on that side. We're taking a microphone straight to you. Once again, your name, where you're from, tell us what you think, but we will not hand the microphone to you. Keep it in Maps's hand so she can run away when you overrun.
Sure. Well, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Zayani Moro. I'm with Participatory Development Associates, and my question goes to the representative from the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection. So I'm glad that you're taking the initiative to work with the District Assembly so that more funds can be channeled in the child protection issues, right? But my focus now is on the teachers. Because at PDA, we did a survey on the child abuse cases that were reported in the newspapers, and it turns out between 7 to 10% of perpetrators were actually school authorities. Now, the question is, how are these perpetrators being dealt with, first of all? And secondly, how are you, in collaboration with GES, building the capacities of these teachers to be able to handle effectively child protection issues? Thank you.
Once again, you put your hand up. We'll come to you with a microphone. We have a gentleman in the front row who has some thoughts to share. Let's get a microphone to him. Your name, where you're from, and your question.
Thank you. My name is Gregory Derry. I'm from Well Vision International. I want to find out from the Ministry of Gender what plans they have to ensure adequate allocation of budget for child marriage campaign, and what plans are also there for adoption, Central Adoption Authority. Of late, we've heard a lot about child online. What plans are also in existence to ensure that adequate budgetary allocations are made to combat issues of abuse online? Thank you.
All right. Now, I want to hear from our representative in Parliament before we take another member of the audience, Mr. Daniel Ochemabwaji.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. But listening to all that is going on, I'm compelled to explain basic economics to the extent that human wants are unlimited, but the means to satisfy these wants are limited. Maybe the doctor will agree with me. For that reason, a government has to set priorities, draw a scale of preference, and determine what it wants to do. And that's exactly what we are going through as a country. Our problems in Ghana are many, but the means to satisfy them are quite limited. So I was very glad when Professor said that, how do you finance it? How do you pay for these things? We need to be real. Yes, there are problems. The government thinks that to develop or to let everybody prosper, let's do development organization authorities. That's just the way he thinks. That by basically going through development authorities or even opening up the regions, we can get development to deal with these issues. I know microfinance in Ghana doesn't have a lot of good name, but I've been in it for about 20 years. And if you ask me, microfinance, even though it's a great intervention, it will be able to help deal with some of the challenges of poverty, especially when you take it to rural areas. However, the best way to actually deal with poverty and inequalities is to educate the children of the poor. So there's no price we can put to it. But if we want to deal with this heads-on, given our limited resources, we must be willing to pay for it. Through taxes, more taxes, debt, responsible borrowing, or what? Heritage fund? Yes, the future is now. Let's do something. And that's exactly what the government is trying to do. So from the finance point of view, let's not forget, how do we pay for these things?
It's a good point you've raised.
Yes.
Just before you sit down, allow me to ask you this, because you've mentioned priorities.
Yes.
Okay. So we've seen a video in which, children can't even attend school because it's so far away. Now, that village is on the map.
Yes.
You found it with your ballot boxes
Very
in
good.
the election. So when you are prioritizing between that child and the money you are going to spend clearing land to build a cathedral,
I told you.
how does that work?
No, I completely agree. It's a good question. I completely
This is basic
agree.
economics.
No. Yes, I was trying to teach basic economics so that at least all of us can basically think through these problems, especially when I disagree with Franklin when he said that Parliament has done nothing. The government has never consulted people in education. Come to Bantama constituency. Let's take it local.
I don't think Franklin said that.
My common fund, probably averaging about 50,000 Ghana cedis per quarter. I consulted almost everybody I could consult, so we can decide and put it where our needs are. So we can debate all these things, but let me answer the question. Yes, maybe the choice will not be to build cathedral. I probably don't support it. That is why the government is telling you, let's go and talk to China. Get 2 billion. Okay? Get 2 billion Ghana cedis to come, dollars, come down here, take care of this infrastructure. I'm telling you, let's be very frank. Borrowing in itself is not bad. Yes, it is not. It is how it is not. Unless, to be honest with you, those who have done a little bit of finance will tell you, even companies that do borrow make more profit than those that don't do it. So if, no, please, give me a chance.
Oh,
if you borrow,
it's true. America borrows more than Ghana.
You want to live in America, and you want to go and catch that which they call America is land of opportunities. Go and see what it is. It's all about borrowing. But if you borrow and you invest properly in productive sectors, you expect that these investments will bring the necessary cash flow to take care of the debt. So I sincerely believe that either we pay more taxes because we want many things, and it is the right thing to do, right thing to ask for. The people that were crossing the road, we need to fix some bridge over it. How do you do it? For now, do you want them to die first? No. You cannot still sit there and just let a snake come and bite somebody when you have what? Can last just by you. No way. So let's borrow responsibly, pay more taxes, as the professor said. Yes, we have to. Those who can afford should be ready to pay.
And buy fewer V8s, maybe?
Listen, you're talking about V8s and all those kinds of things. Let's debate it. Let's debate it.
All right, let's debate it. Let's open it up. There's another gentleman in the front row.
Yes, thank you. My name is Donald Agumanu from Water for Rural Africa. The argument is getting interesting. But what I just want to say is this. We can keep on talking about inequality or closing the gap. But the question is, what about bringing in effective governance in managing the resources? Because we have a lot of excess money around. Somebody was talking about the percentage of revenue or the percentage of salaries amounting to 90%. But when you look at the revenue budget versus the capital budget. How much do we have, and what is the kind of projection that we have? How do we then deepen that very component so that we increase revenue? If it's about taxing, you may tax the person, but the judicial management of the taxes, how do we then put in pointers? And this, and I'm not referring to a specific government, but if we want to look at the Ghana we want, where we want to be as a people, in the video, look at the kind of plight. I talk more about water, access to clean water, and I know you're going to go into that very aspect. But the cyclic effects, the value chain of all this, if you want to build a very strong economy that is driven on industrialization, if you don't have water there, the kind of money that goes through the corruption pipe, through a lot of projects, right from the procurement authority to the contractors, to some of the politicians, if I may say it, you realize that we should not have an issue in Ghana if we can manage our resources efficiently and effectively. So this is a very wonderful platform, but I want to advocate the more. That let's deepen the discussion on how do we then manage these revenues through the internally revenue generated machinery, and also the capital markets. How do we look at that? Other external factors come into play. Who is managing those resources? If it's about salary, you can go deeper into the salary. You realize that some of the names there are not existing. And the mirage approach of managing these things is what is killing us. So it is a very wonderful platform, but I want us to see how do we then segment the issues. If we have 200 million Ghana cedis for a sector, what are other external inflows into that? Then let's cap it up with the output and put in scorecards, if I may put it that way, to see how we measure our output properly.
Or scientifically gifted or technologically gifted. Our educational system does not look out for these people and give them the kind of education that they need in order to develop the human capital that we need to advance our country. So I wanted to check, especially the lady from Gender Ministry, what we do, because we are focusing on people with disabilities, fantastic, but there are these other people who are super fantastic that need something else. My child goes to school and people say, your child is dumb. And I'm like, no, what you're teaching the child is, the brain is over and above that. He goes dumb because what you're teaching him doesn't suit him. Can we look at our education to address the other side so that we can meet the needs of these special kids also?
Thank you. Let's come across to this side of the room. Trying to make sure we leave no one behind.
Hi, Kojo.
Hi.
My name is Diana Sachofia-Agbenyo. I'm a student of the University of Ghana, and I'm here to represent the University of Ghana Debate Society. Now, I feel that there's a lot of numbers flying over our heads at this particular conversation. And also to you, in putting these numbers into context, if you are mentioning figures like 9.2 billion allocation to education, how does that look like on the average Monday morning in a school? It means that 90% or 98% of the allocations goes to the teacher, and less than 1% or less than 3%, if you may, goes into chalks, the board, books, transportation to school, and in some cases, even proper seating materials. If you're looking at health, and I think that one thing we should really put into context is that these are not numbers, these are lives. And so if we are going to be very circumspect of the impact these numbers mean, it means that the middle class of this country is taking care of people they shouldn't be taking care of because the government is not really working. And you may debate on if the government is really working, but if it was, a lot of these allocations wouldn't be really important, if you ask me.
All right, well, that's something to think about. Thank you. You've been a great audience. Thanks for those questions. I wish we could take more, but we have literally 3 minutes to get thoughts from our panel and round up. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Mensah Abrampa, before I come to the Gender Ministry, which had most of the questions directed to you.
Given the time, let me just pick on a few. The first one is on the same social protection issue. I think that the government approach, and if you look at the vision of the government, is to go the integrated process, integrated means, where the government has a role in that. The private sector has a role. The community has a role, and the parents also have a role to accomplish. If we do that, we will definitely be able to sustain those who ordinarily will fall out of the sieve. If they fall out, we need to bring them back. If you don't bring them back, they become a liability, and it could be worse off in the future. So there's the need to have a system that could bring them back. But it's integrated. It is not only with Gender Ministry, health is doing it, education is providing some resources for that, water and sanitation. All of them have within it a social protection component, which looks at those who fall out of the sea.
Right, you'll have to forgive me, I have to be a bit ruthless here. I have 1 minute for you.
All right. So I'll put all the child protection questions into one. No, the ministry is really trying to ensure that the protection of the vulnerable, especially children, are mainstreamed also into the works of the various implementing agencies. So from PDA, we are working for education to implement the Safe School projects that seeks to make the school environment very friendly to the children, including ensuring that members of the teaching fraternity, if they do anything to a child within the school system, is dealt with according to them, because there's always a law mandating that somebody who does anything violent against anybody is supposed to be punished. So going through the system. We are still in the process of establishing the adoption authority. At least for the first time in 2 years that we started it, we have allocated a line in our budget going strictly for adoption issues. It's not now going to subsume under the Department of Social Welfare. For next year, we'll be working towards making it an independent agency as per the amended Children's Act to ensure that adoption is done in a sustainable manner. Child marriage also the same thing.
All right. Dr. Osei Sibe, and then we'll save Franklin for last.
Well, thank you. I think from economic perspective, the bottom line really is about achieving macroeconomic stability. Why am I saying that? Because we are talking about social spending, right? And one of the negative effects of mismanaging economy will bring to your economy will be to curtail social spending. We look at the front-loaded fiscal consolidation policy that we went through from 2012, and you can clearly see that the impact has really been disproportionately or hit the poor more than anybody else. You look at extreme poor, the data that Ghana Statistical Service churned out recently, we realize that the number of people who are extremely poor has actually increased from 2.2 to 2.4 in million people. What that means is that if you look at government expenditure on social spending, you realize that from that time on, it's been reducing, largely because of particularly not managing the economy well, means that you have to borrow more, you have to pay more interest on your borrowing, interest servicing go up, you are not able to collect more money, and so you are not able to spend on education and on social protection and on healthcare.
So
if you manage the economy well and ensure that you have macroeconomic stability over time, as Franklin said, such people, you may not have to send so much money to them because they will be part of the economic build-up, they will be part of the growth process, and you will not have to spend so much money on.
Thank you, Prof. 30 seconds, Franklin.
Someone suggested that we must be preventing rather than trying to cure. In 2016, the Ministry of Health's budget on preventive care was 2%. Now, look, on devolution is the best thing to do. The central government cannot be Captain Planet. Thirdly, I've got to say that poverty cannot be compartmentalized. And indeed, if you have government effectiveness, you can take care of most of the stuff, really. And at the end of the day, there's information asymmetry every day. The politician is thinking and having wet dreams, and we are thinking something else. We should stop that.
A round of applause for Franklin Cudjoe, Dr. Cudjoe Mensah Abrampa, as well as Professor Eric Osei.